All right, welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're doing a forensic deep dive into the collapse of a beloved corporate titan. We're going to look at the numbers, the strategies, and the fatal missteps of a company that honestly seemed completely invincible. It's a story of incredible innovation, massive wealth, and ultimately, one of the most shocking falls from grace in retail history. For decades, Toys R Us was literally the happiest place on earth for millions of kids. I mean, if you grew up in the 80s, 90s, or even the early 2000s, just hearing that name probably gives you a huge rush of nostalgia, right? The endless aisles, those bright colors, just the sheer mind-boggling scale of the place. It wasn't just a store, it was an institution. And then, poof, almost overnight, one of the world's absolute largest toy retailers just vanished. A massive cultural icon disappeared from our shopping centers. Which brings us to the central mystery we're tackling today. How on earth does a billion-dollar company just go bankrupt? Why couldn't the biggest toy store in the world survive in an industry that consistently grows year after year? Okay, let's dive into this, because to truly understand the fatal business mistakes that destroyed this iconic brand, we actually have to go all the way back to how it was built in the first place. Part 1, the pivot to toys. So, to understand the fall, we really have to start with the rise. Our timeline kicks off right after World War II in 1945. A guy named Charles Lazarus opens up a baby furniture store to cash in on the post-war baby boom. But he quickly notices a pretty critical flaw. Parents buy a crib once. But toys, kids break them, they lose them, they outgrow them. Basically, toys guaranteed foot traffic and repeat customers. Realizing this, Lazarus totally shifted his business model. Fun fact here, he actually started out by just selling a few tricycles and wagons alongside the cribs. But the demand was so explosive, he pivoted the entire operation. It honestly remains one of the most legendary pivots in retail history. Which leads us right into Part 2, total market dominance. That single brilliant realization transformed a local business into an absolute juggernaut. They didn't just open shops, they totally pioneered what we call the category killer model. They built these massive warehouse-style stores at a time when toys were mostly just sold in tiny mom-and-pop shops or cramped corners of department stores. They pushed this aggressive expansion all across America. You'd walk in and boom, you were hit with thousands upon thousands of choices. And they paired this overwhelming inventory with absolute genius marketing. Enter Jeffrey the Giraffe. They turned a simple trip to the store into a full-blown event. Flipping through their massive catalog became a literal holiday shopping tradition for families everywhere. And look, this strategy didn't just create happy memories, it generated unbelievable revenue. We're talking billions in annual sales. Billions! During their golden years, they weren't just a toy store anymore, they were a financial powerhouse. They controlled the market so completely that toy manufacturers would practically beg them for shelf space. All those billions in sales helped them build what seemed like an impenetrable fortress, or what business analysts like to call a moat. This moat was built on a few key things. First, aggressive international expansion made them a global household name. Second, they had unparalleled brand recognition and secured exclusive toy partnerships, meaning if you wanted the hottest, must-have toy of the season, you almost certainly had to go to Toys R Us. And of course, they had massive customer loyalty that spanned generations. Competitors were just utterly crushed under this weight. They couldn't even come close to competing with the sheer scale and inventory that Toys R Us provided. But as we know, things change. Part 3, the retail war begins. Because in business, no fortress is ever truly impregnable. Markets shift, new challengers pop up, and the whole landscape changes. So on one side, you had the traditional model. Toys R Us resting on its warehouse dominance, totally relying on customers driving out to these massive specialized stores. But on the other side, a massive new threat was brewing. Big box retailers like Walmart and Target realized they could use toys as loss leaders. Basically, they'd sell toys insanely cheap, sometimes even taking a loss on them, just to lure parents into the store so they'd buy groceries, clothes, and electronics. And then there was Amazon. Suddenly, you could buy those exact same toys without ever getting off the couch. This ignited a vicious, cutthroat price war that Toys R Us was just not structured to fight. So the really crucial takeaway here is that it wasn't just about fighting new competitors with deeper pockets. It was a fundamental tectonic shift in consumer behavior. Changing shopping habits made traditional retail incredibly difficult. People had less time, they demanded more convenience, and honestly, the novelty of a giant toy warehouse started to wear off when the exact same action figure could just show up on your doorstep in 2 days. Toys R Us desperately needed to adapt. They needed to invest heavily in their stores and build a world-class e-commerce platform, like yesterday. But instead, we get part 4, the leveraged buyout trap. Right when they needed cash the most to modernize and fight off Amazon and Walmart, they walked directly into a massive financial snare. In 2005, Toys R Us was taken private in what's called a leveraged buyout, or an LBO. Now, what's really interesting about this is how it actually works. In an LBO, private equity firms buy a company using a massive amount of borrowed money. It's kind of like buying a huge mansion with an absolutely massive mortgage. Except the destructive detail here is that the debt doesn't sit with the buyers. That heavy, crushing debt is placed directly onto the balance sheet of the company being bought. So literally overnight, Toys R Us was suddenly saddled with billions of dollars in brand new debt. And the financial reality following that buyout was just grim. We're talking hundreds of millions of dollars a year going strictly towards servicing interest payments. Just the interest. The tiny little sliver of capital left over, well, that was all they had to fix their aging stores, improve customer service, and somehow try to build a website to fight Amazon. They were effectively financially starved. Taking on this immense burden severely weakened the company at the exact moment they needed agility and strength the most. Which brings us to part 5, the cliffhanger. Because this story is far from over. In part 2 of this explainer, we're going to cover exactly why Amazon changed everything. We'll look at how that massive debt accelerated the collapse, dive into the final bankruptcy story, and most importantly, unpack the vital business lessons that entrepreneurs can learn from this incredible failure. We've definitely covered a lot of ground today, setting up the board for the final endgame. And it leaves us with one massive lingering question. Could Toys R Us actually have been saved? I mean, was their demise inevitable the second the internet was born? Or did a series of perfectly avoidable, disastrous financial decisions basically murder a brand that could have survived? I want you to really think about that. And join us next time for part 2 to find out. Hey everyone, welcome to The Explainer. I am so pumped you're joining me today because we are embarking on a genuinely gripping investigation. We're doing a full corporate autopsy on what used to be the absolute, undisputed king of retail, Toys R Us. We're going to break down the exact timeline, the hard data, and those crucial business decisions that ultimately tanked the world's largest toy retailer. If you've ever found yourself wondering how a massive, globally beloved brand can just literally vanish off the map, well, you're in exactly the right place. We are going to map out exactly what went wrong, step by step. Okay, let's dive into this. $5 billion. That is the massive jolt that really kicks off the final chapter of their story. I mean, it's a staggering, almost incomprehensible amount of money, and it basically acted like an anchor tied directly to the ankles of a giant. But before we can truly grasp how this specific, massive debt destroyed the company, we kind of need to understand the crazy heights from which Toys R Us actually fell. Just to put things into perspective, back in the 1990s, these guys were at their absolute peak. They were a global empire, the ultimate destination for toys. But then, as we roll into the 2000s, e-commerce emerges, and the whole retail landscape just begins to shift right under their feet. Fast forward to 2005, a massive leveraged buyout happens, which, by the way, is exactly where that $5 billion debt came from. And then by 2018, the whole thing culminates in total bankruptcy. It is a sudden, brutal timeline. They went from seemingly invincible to totally liquidated in a stunningly short window of time. Which naturally brings us to a super provocative question. How does a beloved global empire just vanish overnight? The really dramatic irony of this whole collapse is that they had every single advantage. They had the brand recognition, they had deep supplier relationships, and an incredible global footprint. But, as we're going to see, just having the advantage doesn't mean you automatically get to keep it. To figure this out, we need to look at the very first major culprit that disrupted their empire. And that culprit was a massive paradigm shift in consumer behavior, totally spearheaded by companies like Amazon. Just think about the old Toys R Us model for a second. You get in the car, drive to a huge warehouse-style store, navigate these crowded aisles, and honestly, the pricing was basically a mystery until you literally walked up to the shelf. It was an event, sure, but it was also a chore. Then the new way comes along. Fast delivery, unmatched convenience, and endless aisles that you can just browse right from your couch. Consumer behavior was changing at warp speed. People wanted things fast and easy, while Toys R Us was still relying on people making a physical pilgrimage to their stores. And this brilliantly illustrates the real killing blow of the e-commerce era. Total price transparency. Suddenly, parents didn't have to guess if that hot new toy was cheaper somewhere else. They could literally stand in the middle of a Toys R Us aisle, pull out their smartphone, and instantly check if Amazon or Walmart had it for less. Online shopping meant consumers suddenly held all the power and all the information. And Toys R Us, burdened with the massive overhead costs of running those giant physical stores, just couldn't compete in a race to the bottom on price. Now, what's really interesting about this is that when a competitor like Amazon goes on the attack, you absolutely need cash to fight back. But Toys R Us had an overwhelming chunk of their cash flow going entirely to just the interest payments on that $5 billion debt we talked about earlier. That left them with ridiculously tiny slivers of cash for things like store maintenance or much-needed tech investments. They were literally starving for capital in the exact areas they desperately needed to fund just to survive the digital revolution. To really wrap your head around this cash flow problem, just think of it like a simple household budget. Imagine if 90% of your paycheck instantly went to a massive mortgage every single month. When the roof starts leaking or your fridge completely breaks down, you just don't have the cash to fix it. You're completely paralyzed. And that is exactly what happened to Toys R Us. The money that should have been meant for growth was entirely eaten up by debt obligations. So their stores started looking tired and run down. Their website was clunky and super outdated. They knew they needed to modernize, but the debt paralyzed them. They just couldn't afford to evolve. And unfortunately, that financial paralysis led to a really grim reality. In September 2017, they officially filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. Now, at first, there was actually some hope they could restructure and survive. But then the holiday season completely underperformed. So by January 2018, they announced these massive, sweeping store closures. And just 2 months later, in March 2018, the final hammer dropped, mass layoffs, and a total liquidation of their U.S. business. It was a rapid, cascading failure that absolutely stunned the entire retail world. But, behind all those corporate dates and sterile financial charts, there were real people. The emotional impact on families and workers was absolutely devastating. We're talking about roughly 33,000 employees losing their jobs in the U.S. alone. Imagine workers who had dedicated decades of their lives to this company suddenly left with nothing. And for the customers, it was the heartbreaking loss of a real cultural touchstone. Parents were literally filming their kids crying outside of closing stores. It really wasn't just a business closing. It felt like a piece of everyone's childhood was being liquidated. Looking at all this wreckage, let's move to and see how this builds into a really important exercise in hindsight. We really have to ask, could Toys R Us have actually been saved? Was this collapse completely inevitable, or was it the direct result of specific, totally avoidable choices? If we just rewind the clock for a minute, there are absolutely alternate realities where the toy giant survives. Let's just consider the what-ifs here. What if they had made a much earlier investment in e-commerce instead of initially outsourcing all their online sales to Amazon back in the early 2000s? What if they had transitioned away from those massive, expensive warehouses and moved towards smaller, modern, highly interactive stores? A way better digital strategy combined with a much smaller debt load could have freed up the cash they needed to actually improve the in-store customer experience, making their shops cool, experiential destinations instead of just giant inventory closets. Now, obviously, we can't say for sure that they would have kept dominating, but looking at it objectively, they definitely had a fighting chance if they'd just pulled those levers early enough. And that brings us to arguably the most vital part of our explainer today. Look, we don't just study these corporate failures for the sake of a history lesson. We study them to learn. Let's translate this huge corporate disaster into some highly actionable, practical advice that literally anyone, whether you're a small business owner or a corporate executive, can actually put to use. So the crucial point is that it all boils down to these 6 lessons. First up, never ignore technology. If a new platform emerges, you have to understand it. Second, avoid excessive debt. Keep your leverage low so you actually have the flexibility to pivot when the market shifts. Third, adapt to customer behavior. If people suddenly want curbside pickup or one-click checkout, you got to provide it. Fourth, innovate continuously, because survival literally requires constant evolution. Fifth, fiercely protect your cash flow so you can actually afford to fund that innovation. And finally, think long-term. The private equity buyout prioritized short-term financial engineering over long-term strategic health, and, well, we all saw how that ended. Now, you might be wondering, wait a second, didn't I just see a Toys R Us recently? And yeah, you probably did, because this brand holds such an incredible amount of nostalgic value. The current owners are using licensing deals and strategic partnerships, like setting up small Toys R Us branded sections inside Macy's, and they're even experimenting with much smaller airport-style retail concepts. So no, they aren't the category-killing behemoth they used to be, but their legacy in global retail history is so strong that the brand itself refuses to completely die. As we wrap up this autopsy, here is the absolute ultimate takeaway. Toys R Us didn't fail because people stopped loving toys. Kids still play. Parents still buy gifts. They failed because they couldn't adapt to changing technology, shifting consumer habits, and totally crushing financial pressures. Ultimately, they failed because they stopped evolving. Their massive size, which used to be their greatest weapon, actually became a huge liability the second they needed to be agile. Which leaves us with one final, really vital question for you to ponder today. When you look at your own projects, your own business, or even your own career, are you innovating continuously, or are you on track to becoming the next cautionary tale? Remember, even the absolute biggest companies in the world can fall hard if they choose complacency over evolution. Thank you so much for joining me on The Explainer today. Take these lessons, keep evolving, and I will see you next time.